On a storm-soaked highway, a single mother in a forgotten small town stopped to help a crying biker when every other car sped past. With nothing but her mechanic's skill and quiet compassion, she brought his Harley back to life. But what happened next? That crying biker, carrying the grief of his lost brother, revealed he was the captain of the Hell's Angels, and he and his brothers would return not with trouble, but with a gift that transformed her life forever. This moving story of how helping a crying biker sparked hope and redemption will stay with you long after it ends. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The rain didn't just fall that night, it hammered the streets like it wanted to scrub the world clean. Sheets of water slashed across the highway, swallowing headlights, bending trees, and shaking the ground. Every sane driver kept moving, rushing home to warmth, pretending the storm wasn't there. But on that dark stretch of road, a motorcycle sat silent. Its chrome gleamed beneath the lightning, steam curling from the engine like a wounded animal gasping for breath. Beside it, a man crouched low, helmet tilted, shoulders trembling. He wasn't fixing the bike. He was breaking apart in the open, crying into the storm. Cars flew past him, blind, indifferent. Nobody stopped. Nobody except one. An old Ford station wagon pulled over just a few feet ahead. From it stepped a woman in her mid-30s, rain drenching her denim jacket, hair matted against her cheeks. Her name was Rebecca Lawson, a mechanic by trade, a survivor by necessity. She didn't bring an umbrella, didn't need one. She carried something stronger, calm, quiet resolve. Rebecca walked toward him, careful not to startle the man, her voice soft but steady, almost swallowed by the roar of the rain. "Do you need a hand?" The biker didn't look up right away. Rain poured off his helmet in heavy streams, running down his leather jacket and pooling at his boots. For a moment, Rebecca thought he might ignore her completely. Then he lifted his head, just enough for her to catch his eyes, bloodshot, red-rimmed, the kind of eyes that had seen too much pain in too short a time. His jaw was clenched tight, like he was holding back something bigger than tears. Rebecca knew that look. She'd seen it in the shop when men came in with busted engines and heavier stories. Sometimes people didn't need questions. They just needed a pair of hands that wouldn't judge. She crouched beside the bike, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. "Let's take a look," she said simply. The man hesitated, then gave a small, almost reluctant nod. Rebecca pulled a flashlight from her jacket pocket, clicked it on, and scanned the wiring beneath the seat. The rain made everything slick, but her fingers moved with practiced ease, steady, precise. Years of rebuilding old engines in her father's dusty garage had taught her how to fix machines with nothing more than instinct and grit. She worked quietly. The only sounds were the storm hammering the pavement, her soft curses under her breath when a wire slipped, and the sharp snap as she stripped casing with a pocket knife. The biker watched her, silent. His breathing steadied, though his shoulders still shook from something deeper than cold. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't explain why he'd been crying. And Rebecca didn't press. After a few minutes, she twisted the last wire into place and closed the seat with a firm snap. She gave the tank a pat. "Try it now." The man slid onto the seat, turned the key. The Harley coughed, sputtered, and then roared back to life, engine growling against the storm like it had been waiting for a reason to fight again. Rebecca smiled faintly, relief warming her despite the cold. She stepped back, wiping rain from her hands onto her soaked jeans. For a long moment, the biker just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. Then, slowly, he reached out his hand. It was rough, calloused, trembling slightly. Rebecca took it without hesitation. His grip was firm, but his eyes carried something raw gratitude tangled with disbelief. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the engine. Rebecca shook her head. "Don't thank me. Just get yourself home safe." He nodded once, lowered his visor, and pulled the bike back onto the road. Within seconds, the red glow of his tail light vanished into the rain. Rebecca stood there for a moment, water dripping from her jacket, her heart heavy in a way she couldn't quite name. Then she turned, climbed back into her old Ford, and drove the rest of the way home, her mind buzzing louder than the storm. Her little house sat at the edge of town, paint peeling, roof patched with more stubbornness than money. The lights inside glowed soft yellow, spilling against the rain. As Rebecca stepped in, her teenage daughter, Hannah, looked up from the couch. "Mom, you're soaked!" Hannah exclaimed, tossing her blanket aside. Rebecca forced a tired smile, kicking off her sneakers. Roadside rescue? Nothing new. Hannah eyed her skeptically. The way 15-year-olds do when they know there's more to the story. Rescue who? Rebecca hesitated, unzipping her jacket. Just a man who needed help with his bike. Her daughter's brows furrowed. He looked scary, didn't he? Rebecca paused. She thought of those broken eyes in the storm, the way his voice cracked around two simple words. She sank into the armchair, exhaling slowly. He looked lost, she admitted. But nobody should cry alone on the side of the road. Doesn't matter who they are. For a while, the house was quiet except for the hum of the old space heater. Hannah studied her mother, then whispered, "You're like some kind of real-life superhero." Rebecca chuckled softly, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "Nah, just a mechanic trying to do right." But later that night, as the storm eased and silence settled over the small house, Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills. She rubbed her tired hands together, wondering if the world ever really noticed when people like her showed up for others. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that miles away, in a dimly lit bar, that same biker sat among a circle of leather-clad men. His hands shook as he held up a photo of his brother, gone too soon. And with a voice heavy with grief, he told them about a woman who stopped in the rain. A woman who didn't ask questions. A woman who fixed more than just a bike. A woman who gave him a reason to believe again. And by sunrise, the engines of more than 30 riders would rumble awake, rolling toward the quiet edge of town to find her. Rebecca Lawson had no idea her life was about to change forever. Morning in Maple Hollow usually came soft and slow, sunlight spilling through pine trees, coffee brewing in quiet kitchens, birds chattering like they had all the time in the world. But that morning was different. The first sound was faint, a low hum on the horizon. Rebecca, standing at her kitchen counter pouring cereal for Hannah, barely noticed. She thought it was the old furnace groaning again. But within moments, the sound grew heavier, deeper. The spoons rattled in their bowls. The coffee mug trembled. Outside, the birds scattered into the gray sky as if they'd sensed something bigger than thunder. Mom Hannah asked, wide-eyed, "Spoon frozen mid-air?" "What is that?" Rebecca wiped her hands and moved to the window. She tugged the curtain back and froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Engines, dozens of them, motorcycles rolling in from the highway like a steel river, chrome flashing in the morning light, leather jackets gleaming dark against the pale dawn. They weren't wild, weren't chaotic. They rode in unison, steady, deliberate. Rebecca's first instinct was protective. Get Hannah to safety, shut the door, brace herself. But as the bikes drew closer, something in her chest shifted. They didn't look like men riding for trouble. They looked like men riding with purpose. The first bike pulled to a stop in front of the small house. The others lined up behind, engines growling like a single heartbeat. Neighbors peeked from curtains. Some ducked out of sight, whispers spreading like wildfire. Why are they here? Rebecca stepped outside before fear could root her to the floor. Rainwater still clung to the earth from last night's storm, and the air smelled of damp pine. She held her chin high, though her pulse raced. The first rider swung off his Harley and removed his helmet. It was him, the man from the storm. Except now, his face wasn't broken. His tears were gone. He stood tall, steady. And when his eyes met Rebecca's, there was weight in them, but not despair. Gratitude. He took a step closer, boots crunching against the gravel. His voice was quiet but carried over the silence of 30 men watching. I didn't get to thank you last night. Rebecca swallowed hard, her throat dry. You don't have to, she said, glancing nervously at the rows of riders. You looked like you needed someone. That's all? The man he finally spoke, his name. Caleb. His voice cracked just slightly as he said it. Then he continued. My brother died 2 nights ago. I was trying to ride to the lake where we used to go, but I broke down. And I broke down inside too. You fixed my bike. But more than that, you reminded me not everyone turns away when a man's on his knees. Rebecca's chest tightened. She wanted to respond, but words seemed too small for the weight of what he was saying. Hannah had edged onto the porch, clinging to the doorway, her eyes wide. One of the bikers noticed her and, to Rebecca's surprise, gave a small, gentle smile. Not mocking, not threatening, just human. Caleb turned back to Rebecca. I told my brothers what you did, that someone in this town reminded me there's still hope, and we came here to honor that. Rebecca blinked. Stunned. Honor? I don't understand. Caleb nodded toward the riders. They stood silently, hands clasped, leather vests catching the light. Some held their helmets to their chests. The sight was unlike anything Maple Hollow had ever seen. We don't forget kindness, Caleb said softly. Not ever. And we don't leave until we give something back. For a long moment, time stood still. The sound of idling engines filled the air like a hymn. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the street, whispering, half afraid, half in awe. Rebecca's knees felt weak. She was just a mechanic, a single mother scraping by, fixing things no one else had time for. She never thought stopping in a storm would ripple into something this big, this loud. She looked at Caleb. Then at the circle of men around her yard. Hannah clutched her sleeve. Mom, she whispered. Are they angels? Rebecca knelt down, brushing wet hair from her daughter's forehead. Her voice shook as she answered. Not the kind with halos. Sweetheart, just brothers looking out for each other. Caleb's jaw tightened, emotion flickering in his eyes. He stepped forward, pulled something from his vest, and placed it in Rebecca's hand. A patch, red and white, frayed at the edges. This was my brother's, he said. He gave it only when someone changed his life. Not everyone earns it. You did. Rebecca stared down at it, the fabric heavy as iron in her palm. But I'm not one of you. Caleb shook his head slowly. That's the point. You didn't have to be. The air grew still. 30 riders stood silent as stone, waiting. And in that silence, Rebecca realized her life was no longer just her own. Something had begun on that rain-soaked highway. Something she couldn't stop, even if she wanted to. And Maple Hollow would never see her the same way again. Rebecca didn't sleep much that night. After the roar of engines faded down the road, silence felt almost too sharp, too fragile. She sat at the kitchen table, the red and white patch resting in her palm, its edges frayed with time. It was just fabric, but it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Across the table, Hannah leaned on her elbows, chin propped in her hands. "Mom," she whispered. "Are they going to come back?" Rebecca glanced toward the window, where the storm clouds had finally broken, leaving only the soft glow of moonlight. "I don't know," she admitted, "but something tells me they're not done." The next morning, Maple Hollow buzzed with rumors. At the diner, old men nursed coffee and muttered about 30 bikers lining up in front of Rebecca Lawson's little house. At the grocery store, 2 women debated whether she was in trouble or whether she had saved someone important. Children whispered on their way to school. "Did you see them? Did you hear the engines?" Rebecca kept her head down at the auto shop where she worked part-time. Grease under her nails, a wrench in her hand. She tried to lose herself in carburetors and timing belts, but she could feel eyes on her, curious, cautious, even reverent. She wasn't just Rebecca the mechanic anymore. She was the woman who stopped when no one else did. By late afternoon, the rumble returned. Not as fierce this time, just a few bikes. When she stepped outside, Caleb was there. Helmet tucked under his arm, exhaustion lining his face. He looked different in daylight, not just a biker, but a man carrying grief like a second skin. "Can we talk?" he asked. Rebecca nodded, wiping her hands on a rag. Hannah peeked from the doorway, uncertain. They walked to the edge of the lot, gravel crunching underfoot. For a while, Caleb said nothing. Then he pulled a photo from his jacket, a younger version of himself, and another man, both grinning on a beat-up Harley. His brother? "He was my anchor," Caleb said, voice low. "When he died, I thought the road would swallow me whole. That night, I didn't want help. I didn't think I deserved it. But you stopped anyway." Rebecca studied the picture, her chest aching. "You looked like someone who shouldn't be alone in the rain," she said softly. Caleb met her eyes. "That patch I gave you, it isn't just cloth. My brother used to give his to people who reminded him the world still had decency. Now it's yours, because you reminded me." Rebecca's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to say she was just a mechanic who did what anyone should have done. But deep down, she knew not everyone would have pulled over. Not everyone would have looked past the leather, the scars, the fear. For the first time, she realized her small act hadn't just fixed a bike. It had shifted something in a man's soul, maybe even in 30 men's souls. That weekend, the riders came again not to intimidate, not to cause trouble, but to work. Neighbors gawked as leather-clad giants hauled lumber, measured planks, and hammered nails beside Rebecca's little house. Caleb explained it simply. "You gave me back my road. Now we're giving you one too." Rebecca watched in stunned silence as her yard transformed. By sundown, the frame of a garage stood tall where weeds once grew. She had always dreamed of her own space to work, a shop where she could build a future for Hannah. She just never thought it would come from the hands of men most people feared. Hannah brought out lemonade and sandwiches, her shy smile disarming even the roughest faces. One rider, 6'5", tattoos curling down his arms choked up when she taped a crayon drawing to the trailer door that read, "Thank you." Rebecca's heart swelled, breaking in ways she couldn't name. For years, she'd felt invisible, just another single mother patching bills, fixing engines, carrying the weight alone. But now, standing among men who treated her small patch of earth like sacred ground, she realized kindness wasn't small. It echoed. That night, as the last hammer fell silent, Caleb handed her a set of keys. "It's not finished yet," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But it's yours. No strings, no rent. You earned it." Rebecca stared at the keys in disbelief. "Why me?" Caleb's eyes softened. "Because when the world broke me down, you didn't drive past. And that matters more than you think." For the first time in years, Rebecca Lawson didn't feel like just a mechanic trying to scrape by. She felt seen. She felt strong. And as the sun dipped behind the pines, she realized something else. She hadn't just changed the life of a grieving biker. She had changed her own. Rebecca woke before dawn. The sky still painted in shades of charcoal and blue. She stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in her hands, and stared at the half-built garage beside her trailer. Wooden beams rose from the dirt like the bones of a dream she never thought would be hers. She ran her fingers along the rough frame, still smelling of fresh-cut pine. For years, she'd worked in other people's shops, taking whatever hours they offered, sometimes paid, sometimes owed. Now, she was looking at something different, her own place. Not a handout, a home for her craft. Hannah came shuffling out, hair wild from sleep, rubbing her eyes. "It's real, isn't it?" she murmured. Rebecca smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "Yeah, baby. It's real." By mid-morning, the bikers were back. Not 30 this time, but enough to fill the yard with the sound of hammers, saws, and laughter that didn't quite match their rugged faces. Caleb moved among them, not barking orders but working shoulder to shoulder, sweat dripping, voice calm. Rebecca found herself swept into the rhythm, hauling boards, holding ladders, even arguing over measurements like she belonged there. For the first time in years, she felt a team at her back. Neighbors gathered at the fence line, whispering. Some snapped photos on old phones. Others just shook their heads in disbelief. Hell's Angels building a garage for Rebecca Lawson. It sounded like something out of a tall tale. But there it was, rising beam by beam. By evening, the structure had walls, a roof line, and the skeleton of a door wide enough for a Harley to roll through. Rebecca stood in the center, wiping sweat from her forehead, staring up at what was becoming her future. Caleb stepped beside her, arms crossed, his voice steady. "When it's done, this will be yours. No rent, no strings." Rebecca shook her head. "Overwhelmed. I can't accept this. It's too much." Caleb's gaze was firm but kind. "You didn't ask me to build this. Same way I didn't ask you to stop on that road. Some things aren't about debt. They're about meaning." Rebecca stared at him, searching his face for the catch but found none, only sincerity. Over the next week, the garage took shape faster than she could believe. Hannah darted between the men, passing out water bottles, handing over nails, even drawing chalk hearts on the fresh concrete floor. The bikers didn't laugh at her. They treated her like family. One even let her sit on his bike, her grin wide as the engine rumbled beneath her. At night, Rebecca would sit at the kitchen table with her notebook, usually filled with unpaid bills and side jobs. Now, for the first time, she wrote something else: ideas for the garage, engine rebuilds, paintwork, custom jobs, maybe even a sign out front. The possibilities made her dizzy. A week later, Caleb knocked on her door before sunrise. Rebecca opened it to find him holding 2 helmets. "Ride with me," he said simply. Rebecca hesitated. "Hannah." "She can stay here. Moose and the boys will watch her," Caleb assured. Something in his tone left no room for fear. Rebecca pulled on the helmet, climbed onto the back of his Harley, and held tight as the bike roared to life. They rode through the waking pines, the wind biting, the horizon glowing orange. For 20 minutes, the world was nothing but engine and sky. Finally, Caleb pulled over at a quiet lake, glassy and still. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the same photo she'd seen before him and his brother, laughing on a Harley years younger. He crouched by the water's edge, placed it gently on the surface, and let it float. "This was our place," Caleb said, voice breaking. "When life got too heavy, we came here. That night, I thought I'd never make it. But maybe I wasn't supposed to come alone." Rebecca stood beside him in silence. The morning light painting ripples gold. She didn't need to say anything. Sometimes, silence was the loudest language. By the time they rode back into town, Rebecca knew her life was no longer small, no longer hidden. The garage wasn't just walls and tools, it was opportunity, a chance to build more than engines, a chance to build a future. That evening, as the bikers packed up their tools and neighbors whispered in awe, Hannah wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. "Mom," she whispered, eyes shining. "You're not just fixing bikes anymore. You're fixing people." Rebecca's chest ached, full and heavy. She held her daughter close, staring at the rising garage. For the first time in years, she believed it might be true. The garage opened quietly. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, no fanfare. Just Rebecca unlocking the wide steel door one cool morning. Hannah at her side, a thermos of coffee in her hand. The smell of fresh sawdust still lingered, mixing with the faint scent of oil and rain-soaked earth. She expected the first weeks to be slow, maybe a neighbor with a rusty lawnmower, maybe an old pickup that wouldn't start. But word spread faster than she could imagine. First came a farmer with a broken tractor belt, then a retired veteran with a scooter that hadn't run in years. Then 2 young men pushing an old dirt bike between them, saying they'd seen her story online. Rebecca worked the way she always had, steady, careful, patient. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't invisible. Neighbors who once barely nodded now brought pies, tools, even spare parts. Children gathered near the fence to watch her work, wide-eyed, whispering that the biker lady was fixing more than machines. The garage had become something more, a place people brought not just engines, but pieces of their lives. The bikers didn't disappear either. Caleb and his crew came by often, not to intimidate, but to lend a hand. One afternoon, Moose, the towering rider with tattoos curling down his arm, spent 3 hours hauling lumber scraps into neat piles. When Hannah handed him a glass of lemonade, he choked up at the crayon sign she'd taped above the workbench, fixing more than bikes. Rebecca found herself laughing more, to something she hadn't done freely in years. She caught herself singing along to the radio while tightening bolts, or joking with Hannah about who could get dirtier by the end of the day. The heaviness she had carried, loneliness, unpaid bills. The quiet ache of feeling unseen began to loosen its grip. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Rebecca wiped grease from her hands and noticed Caleb standing at the edge of the lot, watching. "You're different," he said simply. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "You used to walk like the world was pressing on your shoulders. Now you stand taller, like you remembered who you are." Rebecca looked around the garage, at Hannah sketching motorbikes in chalk across the driveway, At the honor wall she'd started inside with photos of lost brothers, fathers, and friends that customers had given her. She swallowed hard. Maybe I finally found a place I belong. Caleb nodded slowly. Or maybe you created one. But growth wasn't just about recognition. It was about responsibility. And Rebecca felt it every day. She stayed up late balancing books, making sure the garage could sustain itself. She taught Hannah how to read spark plugs, how to handle a wrench. Not because she expected her to follow in her footsteps, but because she wanted her to understand the power of fixing things with her hands, with her heart. One night, Hannah curled up on the couch, glasses slipping down her nose, and asked, "Mom, are we famous now?" Rebecca chuckled softly, tucking a blanket around her daughter. "Not famous, sweetheart. Just seen. There's a difference." As weeks turned into months, Rebecca grew into someone she barely recognized. The timid mechanic who once questioned if she mattered had become the woman people sought out, leaned on, admired. The townsfolk no longer whispered in fear when engines rolled through Maple Hollow. They nodded in respect. Because Rebecca Lawson, the woman who once stopped for a stranger crying in the rain, had shown them something they'd almost forgotten, that compassion could change everything. And in those moments, tightening bolts under the soft hum of the radio, Hannah passing her tools with a grin, and Caleb quietly standing nearby like an anchor, Rebecca realized something profound. She hadn't just fixed a broken Harley. She had rebuilt herself. Summer arrived in Maple Hollow with warmth that seemed different from summers past. The air felt lighter, the days longer, as if the whole town had exhaled something heavy it had been carrying for years. And at the center of it all stood a small garage with peeling white paint and a hand-painted sign, "Lawson Repairs." But for everyone who came through its door, it wasn't just a shop. It was a sanctuary. It started with the Brotherhood Run, one Saturday afternoon, without flyers, without announcements. 30 riders rumbled into town again. Rebecca froze when she heard them, half expecting trouble, half expecting gratitude. But what she saw that day would stay with her forever. The bikers weren't there to demand anything. They came bearing a gift. Together they rolled a tarp-covered object into the garage and set it in the center. Caleb looked at her, his face solemn but soft. "Uncover it," he said. Rebecca hesitated, then pulled back the heavy fabric. Beneath it stood a custom-built motorcycle, matte black with silver trim, flames etched along the tank. But it wasn't the beauty of the machine that stole her breath. It was the artwork, airbrushed onto the side, a woman holding the hand of a young girl, standing beneath a stormy sky, while a motorcycle rode into the horizon. Beneath the image were 4 words fixing more than machines. Rebecca's knees buckled. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling before she could stop them. Hannah stepped forward, eyes wide, whispering, "That's us." Moose, the towering rider with the voice like thunder, cleared his throat. "We built it from pieces of our own bikes. You don't owe us anything. But you need to know you changed us." Rebecca shook her head, unable to speak. Caleb placed the keys gently into her palm. "This isn't just a bike. It's a reminder. Ride it when you forget what you're capable of." The story spread not through newspapers at first, but through whispers. Farmers told it over coffee. Mothers shared it at school drop-off. Truckers carried it to the next town. When the media eventually showed up, cameras flashing and microphones shoved in her face, Rebecca turned them away. "This isn't a headline," she said. "It's life. It's grief. It's grace. And some things don't belong in sound bites." And somehow, the truth of that made the story spread even faster. Letters began arriving, handwritten notes from strangers in other states. A widow who said Rebecca's kindness reminded her to believe again. A young man who'd lost his father and finished restoring his first bike because he'd read her story online. One letter simply said, "Thank you for proving the world still has people like you." Rebecca read each one at the kitchen table with Hannah at her side, heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years' legacy. The honor wall inside the garage grew. 2. At first, just Caleb's photo of him and his brother. But then others came. Families who'd lost loved ones brought pictures. A veteran left a framed patch from his unit. A teenager hung a Polaroid of himself and his dad with their first mini bike. Rebecca framed each one and gave it a place. Hannah dusted the wall every weekend, lighting a small candle at the base. "These aren't just pictures," she said one night. "They're stories." Rebecca nodded, throat tight. And stories keep us alive. One evening, after a long day, Rebecca sat on the porch swing with Hannah asleep against her shoulder. The stars spread across the velvet sky, quiet and endless. Caleb pulled up on his Harley, the rumble low and steady. He didn't say much, just sat beside her, both of them watching the night. "Finally," he murmured, "my brother would have liked you." Rebecca smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "Maybe he already does." They sat in silence. The kind that felt holy, the kind that stitched broken things back together. In the months that followed, Maple Hollow shifted. People no longer flinched when bikers rolled into town. They waved, they remembered, because Rebecca Lawson, just a mechanic, just a mother, had given them a story that proved kindness wasn't weakness. It was strength. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Rebecca knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't just fixing engines anymore. She was fixing legacies, healing grief, and building something far louder than the roar of a motorcycle. She had no idea how far the ripples would reach, but one thing was certain: her hands, once calloused from turning wrenches, were now known for something far greater. Hands that refused to drive past. Hands that proved compassion could change the road ahead. And as the engines echoed into another summer night, Rebecca Lawson realized she was no longer just surviving. She was alive. Fully, fiercely, and finally. Anyone can choose to stop if they're willing to look past fear and believe that compassion still matters. As the sun dipped low over Maple Hollow, Rebecca Lawson stood in her new garage, not just tightening bolts, but sketching plans for something bigger, a space where broken machines and broken people could be made whole again. She knew now the choice she once made in the rain wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every single parent fighting to stay afloat, every stranger who had ever been overlooked, and every soul who thought they were beyond saving. The mechanic who once felt invisible had become the woman who rebuilt more than engines. She rebuilt hope. Because for Rebecca, and for those who would follow her example, kindness was never weakness. It was power. And it wasn't the end of the road. It was only the beginning. The end. Up next, more powerful, true stories waiting for you. Click to keep riding with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe kindness can change the world.